I'd like to start off with this verse from Matthew 7:21 through 27, where Jesus said, "Therefore, whosoever heareth these sayings of mine and doeth them, I will liken him unto a wise man which built his house upon a rock. And the rain descended, and the floods came, and the winds blew, and beat upon that house, and it fell not, for it was founded upon a rock." And I want to emphasize the first few phrases there where Jesus says, "Whoever hears these sayings of mine and does them." That's what I want to emphasize in this little presentation. I'd like to share a story now that from a book that I read a while back, and it really emphasizes some important points here. It was a hot, sultry day on Trinidad during World War II. A group of U.S. soldiers stationed there were expecting to work at the Naval Hospital, but their orders were changed to doing grounds work instead. For 10 of those sailors, this posed a major problem. They were Seventh-day Adventists, and this day was Sabbath. They would have been willing to do hospital care as an act of mercy, but they believed that grounds work was unnecessary labor, and they refused. They were arrested and sent to prison for disobeying an order. While in prison, they again refused to work on Sabbaths, even after being ordered to do so by high-ranking officers. They were being true to God. The Navy considered it mutiny. They were threatened with court-martial for disobeying a direct command. Bravely, 6 of the men continued to stand firm for the Sabbath. 4 of them did not. Why? At one of their interviews with a major, he had on his desk some playing cards and cigarettes that had been confiscated from those 4 men. He had done his homework, and he knew that these were not in accordance with Seventh-day Adventist belief. Their compromise had caught up with them, and they crumbled under the pressure. They realized they would not be able to stand on the grounds of religious beliefs in a court-martial. The other 6 stood the trials and tests, which were many, and because of their faithfulness, the rules in the Navy were changed, making it easier to keep Sabbath in the Navy for all that came after them. So as we think about that, we think about this question: what will it take to stand through the tests that are rapidly coming on the world? There's things that are going on now that are pointing towards some really difficult times ahead of us. Are we ready for those trials? Those 6 men who stood the test and carried on through that whole ordeal were faithful Sabbath keepers before they were drafted into the Navy. They were consistent. We can be faithful in the coming crisis only if we are totally faithful to God now and are willing to do whatever He says and suffer for Him if necessary. And they also weren't hiding anything of compromise in their pockets. We can't have any compromise anywhere in our lives if we want to stand through the trials. We must be obedient in everything that Scripture and the Spirit of prophecy tell us. So we ask the question: what is in your pocket? What is going on in your life? Is there anything hidden? We have these verses from Proverbs 28:13 and Luke 12:2. He that covereth his sins shall not prosper, but whoso confesseth and forsaketh them shall have mercy. And then from Luke, there is nothing covered that shall not be revealed, neither hidden that shall not be known. What might be hidden in your life? The strongest bulwark of vice in our world is not the iniquitous life of the abandoned sinner or the degraded outcast. It is that life which otherwise appears virtuous, honorable, and noble, but in which one sin is fostered, one vice indulged. To the soul that is struggling in secret against some giant temptation, trembling upon the very verge of the precipice, such an example is one of the most powerful enticements to sin. He who, endowed with high conceptions of the life and truth and honor, does yet willfully transgress one precept of God's holy law, has perverted his noble gifts into a lure to sin. Genius, talent, sympathy, even generous and kindly deeds may become decoys of Satan to entice other souls over the precipice of ruin for this life and the life to come. So, are we a lure to sin or a decoy of Satan because of the kind of life we live? As we look at this picture, which way will this tree fall when it's cut? If you just don't try to do any manipulating to it, which way is it going to fall? It will fall in the way that it's already leaning a little bit. Even if it's only a little bit leaning, it will go that way. Our thoughts and purposes are the secret springs of action, and hence determine the character. The purpose formed in the heart need not be expressed in word or deed in order to make it sin and bring the soul into condemnation. Every thought, feeling, and inclination, though unseen by men, is discerned by the eye of God. So, which way are you inclined? Are you inclined toward God's kingdom? That things in your life make you lean that way? Or are you inclined the other direction? So, what is inside of you? There is great necessity for close examination in the light of God's Word. Let each one raise the inquiry, am I sound or am I rotten at heart? Am I renewed in Christ or am I still carnal at heart with a new dress put on the outside? Rein yourself up to the great tribunal, and in the light of God examine to see if there be any secret sin that you're cherishing, any idol that you have not sacrificed. Pray, yes, pray as you have never prayed before, that you may not be deluded by Satan's devices, that you may not be given up to a heedless, careless, vain spirit, and attend to religious duties to quiet your own conscience. We had an experience that kind of illustrated this. We were working on building a fairly large house, and it was of the post and beam type of construction, where you use large beams bolted together and fastened in other ways to make the major framework, and then you build around that with all the other framing and everything else. And we were using some beams that had been recycled. They had been taken out of another project and they'd laid around for a few years, but they still looked pretty good. And they were large, like 6 inches thick and 18 inches deep and 25 feet long or whatever. Anyhow, they were large beams. Well, when it came to actually using them and putting them into the structure, we could see that there were some flaws in some of them. And so as we were cutting into them, we would find out just how deep those flaws went. And some of them looked pretty good on the outside, but when we were cutting them to the right length and the right dimensions, we'd find rot on the inside. It didn't show on the outside until we cut them open. And then there were some of them that we had to totally reject because there was just too much rot on the inside, even though they did look good on the outside. And of course, there was the opposite also. There were some that looked pretty rough on the outside, but we could scrape off the surface rot and they were good through the middle, and so we could use those. But the ones that were rotten on the inside, we had to reject. And so, again, I asked the question, what is on your inside? When we look into the life of Daniel and the 3 other young men that were with him, we see consistency. And we have a few verses here that kind of illustrate that. Right at the beginning of the story, it says, "But Daniel purposed in his heart." He made a decision early on that he would stand for God. And we see that through his life. He was faithful all the way through. And then a little ways into the story, where the 3 friends were brought before the king and threatened. They were supposed to bow down to the image, and they refused. And so Nebuchadnezzar called them in front of him and wanted to give them another chance. But this was their response. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego answered and said to the king, "O Nebuchadnezzar, we are not careful to answer thee in this manner." In other words, you don't need to give us another chance. You don't need to be careful of how you do this. We've already made up our mind. If it be so, our God whom we serve is able to deliver us from the burning fiery furnace, and he will deliver us out of thy hand, O king. But if not, be it known unto thee, O king, that we will not serve thy gods, nor worship the golden image which thou hast set up. They had made a decision prior to this, and they were consistent in keeping to that decision. And then we have the story of Daniel, where his fellow rulers didn't like him, and they tried to come up with something that they could get him in trouble with. And of course, they made the law that nobody was supposed to pray to any god except to the king. And this was what Daniel did about that. Now, when Daniel knew that the writing was signed, he went into his house, and his windows being open in his chamber toward Jerusalem, he kneeled down upon his knees 3 times a day and prayed and gave thanks before his God, as he did aforetime. There again, he was consistent. He didn't change his usual practice. He didn't adjust anything. He just did what he had always been doing. And of course, it got him in trouble, but he was consistent. Now we have some illustrations of inconsistency. From Isaiah 29:13. Wherefore the Lord said, For as much as this people draw near me with their mouth, and with their lips do honor me, but have removed their heart far from me, and their fear toward me is taught by the precept of men. So they looked good on the outside, but their heart was in a different place. Ezekiel 33:31 and 32. And this is God talking to Ezekiel and giving him a description of the people. And they come unto thee as the people cometh, and they sit before thee as my people, and they hear thy words, but they will not do them. For with their mouth they show much love, but their heart goeth after their covetousness. And lo, thou art unto them as a very lovely song of one that hath a pleasant voice, and can play well on an instrument. For they hear thy words, but they do them not. In Matthew 23:3, do not after their works. Jesus is talking about the religious leaders, and he's telling the people, don't do like they do, for they say and do not. And then in Titus 1:16, they profess that they know God, but in works they deny him, being abominable and disobedient, and unto every good work reprobate. So they make high professions, but they don't live it. And then 2 Timothy 3:5, having a form of godliness, but denying the power thereof, from such turn away. And that's very similar to the verse I started with from Matthew, where it says, those who hear and do what Jesus says will stand. And that's implying if you hear but don't do, you're not going to stand. And there's an illustration of this in our more contemporary life. In 2010, President Barack Obama signed the Affordable Care Act into law. One of the requirements of the law is that businesses must provide health care insurance for their employees, including various forms of contraception for their female employees. David and Barbara Green, the owners of Hobby Lobby stores, had strong religious convictions against certain forms of contraception, and they took their case to court, arguing that that requirement of the Affordable Care Act violated the Free Exercise Clause of the First Amendment and the Religious Freedom Restoration Act of 1993. The U.S. Supreme Court heard their case in 2014 and ruled in their favor, reinforcing the constitutionally guaranteed rights of business owners to operate their family companies without violating their deeply held religious convictions. So they won their case. But there's an interesting factor involved here. One of the factors that the judges considered was how consistently the Greens lived their faith in every aspect of their business. The company plays Christian music in their stores. If you've ever been in a Hobby Lobby, it's kind of an enjoyable place to be because they have decent music. They pay their employees at least double the minimum wage, and they close on Sundays, which would be ordinarily a very busy day. David Green donates half of the company's pre-tax earnings to Christian causes. Over the years, he has funded Christian colleges and universities, Christian missions, and the distribution of nearly 1.5 billion pieces of gospel literature. Over the years, these gifts have totaled nearly $500 million. And so the judges saw consistency there. They could see that this family lived their religious beliefs in everything, not just that they were asking for something for a business loophole or something like that. This was their whole lifestyle. And I think that's a very noble example. So, compromise or consistency. And there's some pretty strong words here in Romans chapter 2, where Paul is talking to his fellow Jews, and he says, Behold, thou art called a Jew, and restest in the law, and makest thy boast of God, and knowest his will, and approvest the things that are more excellent, being instructed out of the law, and art confident that thou thyself art a guide of the blind, a light of them which are in darkness, an instructor of the foolish, a teacher of babes, which hast the form of knowledge and of the truth in the law. And we could kind of paraphrase that and think about it in our own context. Behold, thou art called a conservative Christian, a commandment keeper, a Sabbath keeper, or whatever other title or description you might put in there. And Paul goes on, Thou therefore which teachest another, teachest thou not thyself? Thou that preachest a man should not steal, dost thou steal? Thou that sayest a man should not commit adultery, dost thou commit adultery? Thou that abhorrest idols, dost thou commit sacrilege? Thou that makest thy boast of the law, through breaking the law dishonorest thou God? For the name of God is blasphemed among the Gentiles through you, as it is written, For circumcision verily profiteth, if thou keep the law. But if thou be a breaker of the law, thy circumcision is made uncircumcision. So if you are professing certain things and doing other things that go against that profession, Paul is saying the name of God is blasphemed among unbelievers because of people like that. So we need to be really careful what we're doing. Again, it goes back to that verse from Matthew, to hear and do. Here's a strong quote. Christians should be preparing for what is soon to break upon the world as an overwhelming surprise, and this preparation they should make by diligently studying the Word of God and striving to conform their lives to its precepts. The tremendous issues of eternity demand of us something besides an imaginary religion, a religion of words and forms where truth is kept in the outer court. And if you look into the concept of what truth is and what it means and what it's supposed to do, truth is more than just correct information. Truth is something that is intended to change your life. When you look into what the Bible says about truth and what Spirit of Prophecy says about truth, it's intended to change your life. And if it doesn't make a change in your life, it really isn't of much value to you. Here we have another quote. The light given me is that we are to study more than we do the instructions given to Moses by God after he had proclaimed the law from Sinai. So this is talking about after the Ten Commandments had been given. This is the other things that God told Moses that Moses then repeated to the people. The Ten Commandments were spoken by God himself and were then written on tables of stone to be preserved till the judgment should take place. After the giving of the law, God gave Moses specifications regarding the law. These specifications are plain and explicit. No one need make a mistake. In the day of judgment, we shall be asked whether we have lived in harmony with these specifications. It is because we do not carry out these specifications in all our dealings, in our institutions, our families, and in our individual lives, at all times and in all places, that we do not make greater advancement. It is by the directions that God has given that we shall be judged at the last day. And so I ask the question, what specifications is this referring to? It's the statutes that are given in the Torah, not just the Ten Commandments. It goes beyond that. So, we can look into the Torah and we can ask these questions. Why do we pay tithe? Why is homosexuality wrong? Why is bestiality wrong? Why differentiate between clean and unclean meat? What about body piercing and tattoos? Those things aren't mentioned in the Ten Commandments. They're in the statutes of the Torah. That's where we find these issues brought up. And we believe that we ought to do these things, but they come from the statutes. We have this quote, The closing words of Malachi are a prophecy regarding the work that should be done preparatory to the first and the second advent of Christ. This prophecy is introduced with the admonition, "Remember ye the law of Moses, my servant, which I commanded unto him in Horeb for all Israel, with the statutes and judgments." And this is a message to the people living in the last days, because the book of Malachi is a message for people that are living in the great day of the Lord. And there's quite a few descriptions in that prophecy describing the times that we are living in, and we're reminded of this: remember the law of Moses with the statutes and judgments. So let's look into this a little bit. What are the statutes? In consequence of continual transgression, the moral law was repeated in awful grandeur from Sinai, and that's talking about the Ten Commandments. Christ gave to Moses religious precepts which were to govern the everyday life. These statutes were explicitly given to guard the Ten Commandments. They were not shadowy types to pass away with the death of Christ. They were to be binding upon man in every age as long as time should last. These commands were enforced by the power of the moral law, and they clearly and definitely explained that law. So we can think of the Ten Commandments as the basic universal principles, or maybe we can think of it as the constitution of God's kingdom. That's the basics. And the statutes are the clarifications of how to apply the commandments in various circumstances. And I kind of like to think of an illustration of that in our speed limit laws. The basic principle of speed limit is to drive a safe and prudent speed. Okay, so how do you apply that in various situations? Well, here in North Dakota, where I live, these are the ways of applying the speed limit concept, the speed limit principle, in various circumstances. 20 miles per hour, if your view is obstructed when approaching a railway, an intersection, or a highway, and also when driving near a school during recess, opening hours, or closing hours. So, school zone would be 20 miles an hour. 25 miles an hour in business districts, residential neighborhoods, and public parks. 55 on gravel, dirt, or loose surface roads and on paved 2-lane county or township highways. 65 on paved 2-lane highways. 70 on paved and divided multi-lane highways. And 75 on interstate highways. So we could think of those various speed limits as the statutes, whereas the basic principle of driving a safe and prudent speed is applicable in all of those situations. It's just applied in a slightly different way depending on where you're at. So let's look at some of the issues that come up in the statutes. And I just chose a few. There's many more than what I have here. And I put them in alphabetical order because there's no particular order of importance. So let's just go looking at some of these statutes. The issue of abortion is addressed. It's not called that, but the principle is there. Exodus 21, 22, and 23, it says, "If men strive and hurt a woman with child, so that her fruit depart from her, and yet no mischief follow, he shall be surely punished, according as the woman's husband will lay upon him, and he shall pay as the judges determine. And if any mischief follow, thou shalt give life for life." Okay, this is a situation where a woman has a miscarriage, or whatever you might call it, where her baby is born prematurely because of some violence. And if the baby dies, the principle is, or the statute would be, if the baby dies, the one who caused that death would be considered a murderer. So we can interpret that into abortion in our day. Bestiality, from Leviticus. "Neither shalt thou lie with any beast to defile thyself therewith. Neither shall any woman stand before a beast to lie down thereto. It is confusion. And if a woman approach unto any beast and lie down thereto, thou shalt kill the woman and the beast. They shall surely be put to death. Their blood shall be upon them." There was not supposed to be any sexual relations with animals. Body piercing and tattoos. From Leviticus 19:28, you shall not make any cuttings in your flesh for the dead, nor print any marks upon you. I am the Lord. Charging interest. If thou lend money to any of my people that is poor by thee, thou shalt not be to him as a usurer, neither shalt thou lay upon him usury. If thy brother be waxen poor and be fallen into decay with thee, then thou shalt relieve him, yea, though he be a stranger or a sojourner, that he may live with thee. Take thou no usury of him, or increase, but fear thy God, that thy brother may live with thee. Thou shalt not give him thy money upon usury, nor lend him thy victuals for increase. Thou shalt not lend upon usury to thy brother, usury of money, usury of victuals, usury of anything that is lent upon usury. Unto a stranger thou mayest lend upon usury, but unto thy brother thou shalt not lend upon usury. That the Lord thy God may bless thee in all that thou settest thine hand to in the land whither thou goest to possess it. So it's basically saying to a brother, which in their case would have been an Israelite, somebody that is poor, even a stranger or a traveler. If they were poor, they were not supposed to charge interest on anything that they lent to that person. Clean and unclean meat. And this is broken into several different categories here. Speak unto the children of Israel, saying, These are the beasts which you shall eat among all the beasts that are upon the earth. Whatsoever parteth the hoof and is cloven-footed and cheweth the cud among the beasts, that shall you eat. And of course we know that certain animals have a split hoof and chew their cud, and that would be including cattle, deer, elk, moose, goats, sheep, those kind. But then the Bible also specifically says certain ones are unclean, even though they might have one of those characteristics. The camel chews its cud, but it doesn't have a split hoof. The hare or the rabbit chews its cud, but it doesn't have a split hoof. The pig has a split hoof, but it doesn't chew its cud. And so there's kind of a differentiation there. As far as fish, these shall you eat of all that are in the waters. Whatsoever hath fins and scales in the waters, in the seas, and in the rivers, them shall you eat. So certain kinds of fish have fins and scales. We can see that in the picture of the trout there. But the catfish does not have scales. The lobster doesn't have scales or fins. And there are a lot of other creatures that are eaten nowadays that are specified one way or the other in this rule. So what has fins and scales is considered clean, although nowadays you wonder about that because of all the pollution that's in the water. And among the birds, these are they which you shall have in abomination among the fowls. They shall not be eaten. They are an abomination. And then there's a long list of different kinds of birds that were considered unclean. It's interesting that there are no mention in that area of which ones are considered clean. But from the examples that are given of the ones that are unclean, you can basically say any bird that is a scavenger or a carnivore, which would include owls and hawks and all of them, would be considered unclean. The only ones that we know are clean are the ones that God actually gave to the people for particular uses. He provided quail for them when they were hungry, and in the lists of things that they could bring as a sacrifice, the doves and turtle doves are mentioned. And so those we can pretty well guarantee are considered clean. But I have a picture of a vulture here and a picture of a chicken. Now, chicken and goose and duck and turkey and all of them are considered clean. But if you know about the kinds of things those birds eat, it becomes a little bit questionable. We used to have chickens, and I know that they were not strict vegetarians. They would go and scavenge just about anything they could find. And that's true of some of those other birds too. Especially in commercial production, those birds get fed all kinds of things just to make them gain weight. So it's rather questionable whether any of those are considered clean, according to the Bible principle. Now, there are reasons scientific reasons why there is a differentiation between the ones that are clean and unclean. And if you're wondering about that, if you go to the channel Amazing Discoveries, where Walter Veith has various messages, you can find probably more than one video where he explains some of the scientific reasons for the clean and unclean differentiation there. Now I have a YouTube link here, but it's really long and it would be really hard for you to copy it. But if you go to Amazing Discoveries, I'm pretty sure you can find where he talks about clean and unclean, the whole truth. So there's a good resource for information there. Another subject that is brought up in the Torah is conservation of resources and the natural world around us. And God told them, when thou shalt besiege a city a long time in making war against it to take it, thou shalt not destroy the trees thereof by forcing an axe against them, for thou mayest eat of them. And thou shalt not cut them down, for the tree of the field is man's life, to employ them in the siege. He's basically saying, be careful what you cut down, even though you might want to use these as weapons. Only the trees which thou knowest that they be not trees for meat, thou shalt destroy and cut them down. And thou shalt build bulwarks against the city that maketh war with thee until it be subdued. So he's telling them, preserve the fruit trees because they are important for your food supply. And then he also says, if a bird's nest chance to be before thee in the way, in any tree or on the ground, whether they be young ones or eggs, and the dam sitting upon the young or upon the eggs, thou shalt not take the dam with the young. In other words, don't take the mother bird with the eggs or the babies. Thou shalt in any wise let the dam go and take the young to thee, that it may be well with thee, and thou mayest prolong thy days. By letting the mother bird go, there would be a constant regrowth of those birds, and it wouldn't create a situation of extinction. Okay, there's quite a few places in the Torah that talk about not using fat or blood. There's actually many verses that talk about that. It shall be a perpetual statute for your generations throughout all your dwellings, that you eat neither fat nor blood. And then in Deuteronomy, only be sure that thou eat not the blood, for the blood is the life, and thou mayest not eat the life with the flesh. Thou shalt not eat it, thou shalt pour it upon the earth as water. Thou shalt not eat it, that it may go well with thee and with thy children after thee, when thou shalt do that which is right in the sight of the Lord. And when you think about it, the fat, both the fat and the blood, are concentrations of toxins and hormones and chemicals and a lot of different things in the animal system that come with the meat if you have the blood and the fat with it. And so you're getting animal hormones, and of course nowadays the ones who raise the animals add hormones to make them grow faster and all of that. And so you're getting a high dose of all of that stuff when you eat the meat with the fat and blood. And nowadays it's a serious question, where could you find kosher meat that has the blood drained out? If you go to a normal meat market, it's not going to be kosher meat. And of course nowadays we're also dealing with a lot of disease in the animals and problems like that really make it not good to eat any meat at all, any flesh food. It was interesting, when we were homeschooling our kids, we did some studies of Native American tribes and the different groups around the country, and there was kind of a pattern that the groups that were more agrarian, that raised gardens and crops and used that as a high part of their diet, tended to be more peaceful people. But those that were hunters and nomads and they subsisted mostly on buffalo and other animal meats, tended to be more fierce and warlike. And if you go and look at lists of some of those tribes, you'll see that pattern there. There are certain ones that were known for being fierce and you could almost say hard to get along with, and they were the ones that were hunters. Dress code. The woman shall not wear that which pertaineth unto a man, neither shall a man put on a woman's garment, for all that do so are abomination unto the Lord thy God. And a couple of quotes here from Inspiration. There is an increasing tendency to have women in their dress and appearance as near like the other sex as possible, and to fashion their dress very much like that of men, but God pronounces it abomination. And another one, God designed there should be a plain distinction between male and female dress, and has considered the matter of sufficient importance to give explicit directions in regard to it. For the same dress worn by both sexes would cause confusion and great increase of crime. Keep that in mind. So how do we know that homosexuality is wrong? It tells us in the statutes, thou shalt not lie with mankind as with womankind, it is abomination. If a man also lie with mankind as he lieth with a woman, both of them have committed an abomination, they shall surely be put to death, their blood shall be upon them. So the practicing of homosexuality is an abomination before the Lord. And, there's a lot of discussion about this now. And I would say that we have to use the principle of hating the sin but loving the sinner. People that practice this kind of lifestyle are valuable in the sight of God as a person, even though God hates the lifestyle that they are practicing. If they turn from that lifestyle and repent, God is more than willing to forgive and take away the guilt of that. But if they persist in that lifestyle, that is an abomination to God. Honesty and integrity in our daily life. And of course, there's one of the commandments that says, thou shalt not steal. And then that's elaborated on, you shall not steal, neither deal falsely, neither lie one to another. And this quote from Patriarchs and Prophets, this covers quite a wide territory. False speaking in any matter, every attempt or purpose to deceive our neighbor is here included. An intention to deceive is what constitutes falsehood. By a glance of the eye, a motion of the hand, an expression of the countenance, a falsehood may be told as effectually as by words. All intentional overstatement, every hint or insinuation calculated to convey an erroneous or exaggerated impression, even the statement of facts in such a manner as to mislead, is falsehood. And we could look at the situation of Adam and Eve. When the serpent came to Eve, the first thing that he said was not a lie. He said, did God say, you shall not eat of every tree in the garden? All he did was ask a question, but the way he said it raised a question in her mind and got her to distrust. And so his way of saying it is where the lie came in, not that what he said was actually a lie. We go on here. This precept forbids every effort to injure our neighbor's reputation by misrepresentation or evil surmising, by slander or talebearing. Even the intentional suppression of truth by which injury may result to others is a violation of the 9th commandment. Sometimes we hear somebody talk about that they got a good deal. Well, there's some things to be cautious of. If thou sell aught unto thy neighbor, or buyest aught of thy neighbor's hand, you shall not oppress one another. And we have this quote, the servants of God are obliged to be more or less connected with the worldly by business transactions, but they should buy and sell with a realization that the eye of God is upon them. No false balances or deceitful weights are to be used, for these are an abomination to the Lord. In every business transaction, a Christian will be just what he wants his brethren to think he is. His course of action is guided by underlying principles. A truly honest man will never take advantage of weakness or incompetency in order to fill his own purse. He accepts a fair equivalent for that which he sells. If there are defects in the article sold, he frankly tells his brother or his neighbor, although by doing so he may work against his own pecuniary interests. It's imperative to be totally honest, even though you might not get as much money as you were thinking. Sometimes we also hear somebody say, wow, that was a real steal. Well, here's a commentary that kind of got me thinking. It's from Adam Clarke's commentary on Leviticus 25:14, where it says, "You shall not oppress one another." That's the verse that we had in the slide just before. And his comment is, "You shall take no advantage of each other's ignorance, either in buying or selling. For he that buys an article at less than it is worth, or sells one for more than it is worth, taking advantage in both cases of the ignorance of the vendor or buyer, is no better than a thief, as he actually robs his neighbor of as much property as he has bought the article at below or sold it above its current value." That's something to think about. And I heard about a well-to-do farmer one time that went into a implement dealer. He was a church member. Went into this implement dealer and was trying to make a good deal on a new piece of equipment, whatever it was. And he was so insistent on weaseling the salesman down to a lower and lower price that the salesman finally got frustrated and said, "Why don't you just go somewhere else and not come back here?" Now that is a very poor commentary on a Christian. Treatment of animals. God has concern for his animals. "If thou meet thine enemy's ox or his ass going astray, thou shalt surely bring it back to him again. If thou see the ass of him that hateth thee lying under his burden, and wouldst forbear to help him, thou shalt surely help with him." So even if it's your enemy's animal, you're supposed to get in there and help. "Thou shalt not see thy brother's ass or his ox fall down by the way, and hide thyself from them. Thou shalt surely help him to lift them up again." So God says, get in there and help when there's an animal in distress. And then from Proverbs 12, verse 10, "A righteous man regardeth the life of his beast, but the tender mercies of the wicked are cruel." And in the Spirit of Prophecy, we have some comments on this. "Few realize as they should the sinfulness of abusing animals or leaving them to suffer from neglect. He who created man made the lower animals also, and his tender mercies are over all his works." Psalm 145:9. "The animals were created to serve man, but he has no right to cause them pain by harsh treatment or cruel exaction." And then another one here. It's a story that she was relating to some people. "I will tell you what I saw in the street coming into this place. A boy was abusing a dog. He was a small boy, but I thought, that child is educating himself in cruelty. I thought how my heart would ache if one of you should do as he was doing. I passed along another street, and a well-dressed man who appeared like a gentleman was driving a fine horse. The wind blew a piece of paper under the horse's feet, and he started and jumped to one side. That was all, but the man who appeared to be a gentleman whipped the horse cruelly. He was not satisfied with this. He became more and more excited until he was worked up into a rage. He jumped from the carriage and seized the bit and jerked the horse's head back and then kicked the horse several times with his heavy boot. I thought probably that man began his acts of cruelty as did the little boy upon small animals. He acted the tyrant over God's helpless creatures until the temper and spirit were educated to cruelty. That man could not be a patient, kind, affectionate father. He was cultivating traits of character which would cause others sorrow and make himself miserable." It's important that we treat our animals with kindness and take good care of them. Here is a very big problem: pornography. And there's a whole chapter in Leviticus 18 that addresses this, and then there's other places that also talk about it. But in Leviticus 18, there's verse after verse where it says, "Thou shalt not uncover the nakedness of," and it lists all kinds of different relations of people within the family and near relatives and all that. It's basically saying you are not to see their body exposed. And then Jesus said, "Whosoever looketh on a woman to lust after her hath committed adultery with her already in his heart." So even if nothing is actually done, just the seeing and thinking and looking is considered adultery. And I guess I would add to that, there are times when You might see something, but there's a difference between seeing it and then looking at it. To look at something is a purposeful thing. So we need to be careful. And here are some sad statistics. Those who identify themselves as born-again Christians struggle with pornography and affairs, and it gives some percentages here. This is talking about Christians. 95% admit that they have viewed pornography. 54% look at pornography at least once a month. 44% viewed pornography at work in the last 90 days. 31% had a sexual affair while married. 25% erase internet browsing history to conceal their pornography use. And 18% admit being addicted to pornography, with another 9% thinking they might be. That comes from a news article, actually from a couple years back. I'm not even sure what the statistics would be now. But here's a little bit more current one. It is not just a man's issue. 33% of women ages 13 to 24 seek out porn at least once a month. That is a pretty major problem, and it's very difficult to get over it. People need God's help to get over an addiction like that. The Torah has quite a bit to say about keeping promises. If a man vow a vow unto the Lord, or swear an oath to bind his soul with a bond, he shall not break his word. He shall do according to all that proceedeth out of his mouth. And when thou shalt vow a vow unto the Lord thy God, thou shalt not slack to pay it, for the Lord thy God will surely require it of thee, and it would be sin in thee. But if thou shalt forbear to vow, it shall be no sin in thee. And in Ecclesiastes, there's kind of a commentary that covers this. When thou vowest a vow unto God, defer not to pay it, for he hath no pleasure in fools. Pay that which thou hast vowed. Better is it that thou shouldst not vow than that thou shouldest vow and not pay. And we have the story in the book of Acts of Ananias and Sapphira, how apparently they had made a promise that they would sell a certain piece of property and give the whole price to the gospel work. But then they went back on it. A certain man named Ananias with Sapphira, his wife, sold a possession and kept back part of the price. And we know the end of that story, that God was very displeased with that. And as a strong lesson and a deterrent to the rest of the church, he struck those two people down, and they died for their sin. There's also the regulation of the 7th year debt release. At the end of every 7 years thou shalt make a release, and this is the manner of the release. Every creditor that lendeth aught unto his neighbor shall release it. He shall not exact it of his neighbor or of his brother, because it is called the Lord's release. From Deuteronomy 15. So every 7 years, any debt that was still outstanding, they were just supposed to forgive the debt to their fellow Israelites and just let it go. By the distribution of the land among the people, God provided for them, as for the dwellers in Eden, the occupation most favorable to development, the care of plants and animals. A further provision for education was the suspension of agricultural labor every 7th year, the land lying fallow, and its spontaneous products being left to the poor. Thus was given opportunity for more extended study, for social intercourse and worship, and for the exercise of benevolence, so often crowded out by life's cares and labors. Were the principles of God's laws regarding the distribution of property carried out in the world today, how different would be the condition of the people? An observance of these principles would prevent the terrible evils that in all ages have resulted from the oppression of the poor by the rich and the hatred of the rich by the poor. While it might hinder the amassing of great wealth, it would tend to prevent the ignorance and degradation of tens of thousands whose ill-paid servitude is required for the building up of those colossal fortunes. It would aid in bringing a peaceful solution of problems that now threaten to fill the world with anarchy and bloodshed. And I thought about that situation. If somebody had borrowed money to another person and the debt was carried on for a couple of years, it would appear quite obvious that the person who lent the money out could quite well get along without it because they're getting along just fine for those years when the debt is unpaid. So when it came to the seventh year and they were supposed to totally forgive the rest of the debt, whatever might be left to pay, it would seem quite obvious that they could get along without it, just as they had been getting along without it during those years when it was supposed to be repaid. And the person that was owing the debt, by forgiving them, it would give them a little bit better start to build up their financial situation again. So the person that lent the money can get along without it, and the person that was using the money needed it to help them get started again. And so the 7th year debt release was an important thing to help stabilize the financial situation in that society. There was also the 7th year land Sabbath, which is basically at the same time, and was a kind of two sides of the principle there. When you come into the land which I give you, then shall the land keep a Sabbath unto the Lord. 6 days thou shalt sow thy field, and 6 years thou shalt prune, or 6 years thou shalt sow thy field, and 6 years thou shalt prune thy vineyard, and gather in the fruit thereof. But in the 7th year shall be a Sabbath of rest unto the land, a Sabbath for the Lord. Thou shalt neither sow thy field nor prune thy vineyard. That which groweth of its own accord of thy harvest thou shalt not reap, neither gather the grapes of thy vine undressed, for it is a year of rest unto the land. And then we have this from Patriarchs and Prophets. If the land ordinarily produced only enough to supply the wants of the people, how were they to subsist during the year when no crops were gathered? For this the promise of God made ample provision. I will command my blessing upon you in the 6th year, he said, and it shall bring forth fruit for 3 years, and you shall sow the 8th year, and eat yet of old fruit until the 9th year, until her fruits come in, you shall eat of the old store. So the 6th year would produce so well that they would have carryover into the 7th, 8th, and even up to the 9th year if they would obey what God wanted them to. The observance of the sabbatical year was to be a benefit to both the land and the people. The soil, lying untilled for one season, would afterward produce more plentifully. The people were released from the pressing labors of the field, and while there were various branches of work that could be followed during this time, all enjoyed greater leisure, which afforded opportunity for the restoration of their physical powers for the exertions of the following years. They had more time for meditation and prayer, for the acquainting themselves with the teachings and requirements of the Lord, and for the instruction of their households. And now we can think about some of the tithes and offerings that they were expected to bring, and some of them were voluntary, but there were several that were required. The tithe was required, which is the 10th. There was also a second tithe, which was another 10th, and these two tithes were used for different purposes. The main tithe was given to the Levites and the priests because they didn't have another occupation to earn a living from. The second tithe was kept to be shared with the poor, the widows, the fatherless, the strangers, those that were underprivileged and had needs. The second tithe was used to support them. And there's various verses that describe those things. First fruits, the first of the crops, the first of the animals that were born to a particular mother animal, those were required. The daily burnt offering was required, a lamb in the morning and a lamb in the evening. Sin and trespass offerings were required. And then there was a voluntary burnt offering where somebody could bring an offering just out of their thankfulness to God. There was peace offerings. There was a few other ones. And it seems like quite a large amount of offering, but let's read a few things about this. Here are some applications of some of these in our own time. Every morning and evening a lamb of a year old was burned upon the altar with its appropriate meat offering, thus symbolizing the daily consecration of the nation to Jehovah and their constant dependence upon the atoning blood of Christ. And so the daily burnt offering was an offering of consecration. Well, if a person brought their own voluntary burnt offering, it was kind of a similar thing. They were consecrating themselves to God, and it was like they didn't want to hold anything back. And we have this quote from Steps to Christ: consecrate yourself to God in the morning. Make this your very first work. Let your prayer be, take me, O Lord, as wholly thine. I lay all my plans at thy feet. Use me today in thy service. Abide with me, and let all my work be wrought in thee. This is a daily matter. Each morning consecrate yourself to God for that day. Surrender all your plans to him, to be carried out or given up as his providence shall indicate. Thus, day by day, you may be giving your life into the hands of God, and thus your life will be molded more and more after the life of Christ. And of course, those people would bring peace offerings and some of these other ones. And here are a couple of quotes that speak of those things. Let believers in the truth bring to God a faithful tithe. Let them bring him peace offerings and thank offerings for the great love wherewith he hath loved them. Then there will be no dearth of means in his treasury. If we are as generous with God as he is with us, there would be plenty of funds to accomplish his work. And then this one was kind of interesting. Let the members of every family begin to work over against their own houses. Let them humble themselves before God. It would be well to have a trespass offering box in sight, that's in the family, and have all the household agree that whosoever speaks unkindly of another or utters angry words shall drop into the trespass offering box a certain sum of money. This would put them upon their guard against the wicked words which work injury, not only to their brethren, but to themselves. And we can think about how much they were supposed to bring and what it meant in their life. And I'm going to just skip some of this because I need to hurry on here. But it says, every man shall give as he is able according to the blessing of the Lord thy God, which he hath given thee. No less than 1/3 of their income was devoted to sacred and religious purposes. 1/3. And sometimes people are really grudging about giving a little bit of pocket change. Down a little bit lower in the paragraph, some will pronounce this one of the rigorous laws binding upon the Hebrews. But this was not a burden to the willing heart that loved God. It was only when their selfish natures were strengthened by withholding that men lost sight of eternal considerations and valued their earthly treasures above souls. So if we're honest with God and are willing to give him abundantly, he will take care of us and bless us. Now, there's some interesting things that are also in the Torah about health. I won't go through all of them, but I just wanted to give a little bit of a history behind some of the things that were kind of fascinating to me. The Ebers Papyrus is an Egyptian medical papyrus of herbal knowledge dating to around 1550 BC. That's about the time of Moses and the Israelites in Egypt. It is among the oldest and most important medical papyri of ancient Egypt. This papyrus contains chapters on contraception, diagnosis of pregnancy and other gynecological matters, intestinal diseases and parasites, eye and skin problems, dentistry and the surgical treatment of abscesses and tumors, bone setting and burns. And then I have a book that's called None of These Diseases, which kind of goes into some of these medical things. And in that book it says, this document dates from around the time of Moses and the Exodus. It gives us a glimpse into the medical practice of what was the most advanced civilization in the world at that time. Egypt was the top civilization. Here's a prescription for baldness. Okay, if you're bald, here's what you can do, according to this Ebers Papyrus. Apply a mix of 6 fats from the horse, the hippopotamus, the crocodile, the cat, the snake, and the wild goat. Okay, that's what you do for baldness. There are hundreds of other prescriptions which include ingredients like statue dust, beetle shells, mouse tails, cat hair, pig eyes, dog toes, breast milk, human semen, eel eyes, and goose guts. To deal with a splinter, the ancient Egyptian physicians would apply a salve of worm blood and donkey dung. How would you like that? Another ancient Egyptian medical instruction book. The Edwin Smith Papyrus is an ancient Egyptian medical text named after the dealer who bought it in 1862, and it's the oldest known surgical treatise on trauma. This document, which may have been a manual of military surgery, describes 48 cases of injuries, fractures, wounds, dislocations, and tumors. It dates to 1600 BCE, which is just, again, near the time of Moses and the people of Israel. And so this is some of what is in that medical instruction book. Ancient Egyptians thought epidemics were caused by disease demons. The Smith Papyrus provides this formula for protection. It was supposed to be chanted while a person had 2 vulture feathers held over him. This is what he would say. O flame in his face, O Nekhbet, lifting the earth to the sky for her father, come thou, bind the 2 feathers around me, that I may live and flourish, because I possess this white one. O Caesar of the Great One, son of Sekhmet, mightiest of the mighty, son of the disease demon, flooder of the streams, when thou voyagest into the celestial ocean, when thou sailest in the morning bark, thou hast saved me from every sickness. So how would you like your doctor doing that in order to cure you of a disease demon? It was during this era of medical expertise that God gave his health guidelines to his people in the Torah. And what he gave them is sensible, and it has been proven to be medically and scientifically effective. So, we should probably listen up, even though we don't understand sometimes. So there's a few questions as to why we should do certain things. There's some verses in Leviticus 18:19. Thou shalt not approach unto a woman to uncover her nakedness, as long as she is put apart for her uncleanness. This is speaking of the menstrual period, that there should not be sexual intercourse during that time. And it has been found, there's some indication, that women who have sexual intercourse during their menstrual period have a higher incidence of cervical cancer. So, why should we do it according to the Torah? There is a good reason. Now here's some instructions on what the mother should do after childbirth. Speaking unto the children of Israel, saying, if a woman have conceived seed and born a man-child, then she shall be unclean 7 days, according to the days of the separation for her infirmity shall she be unclean. And in the 8th day the flesh of his foreskin shall be circumcised, and she shall then continue in the blood of her purifying 30 days, in other words, 33 days, which added to the 7 would be 40 days total. She shall touch no hallowed thing, nor come into the sanctuary until the days of her purifying be fulfilled. So for a baby boy, she was to stay quarantined in her home for 40 days. But if she bear a maid child, then she shall be unclean for 2 weeks, that's 14 days, as in her separation, and she shall continue in the blood of her purifying 66 days, that's 66. So basically, 14 and 66 is 80 days, which is twice the number of days as for a boy. Now, why 8th day circumcision? Vitamin K, the blood clotting vitamin, is at its highest level on the 8th day. So in order to avoid bleeding as much as possible, the 8th day was the ideal time for circumcision. And it still is. Baby boys that are circumcised on the 8th day have much less bleeding and trauma than circumcising at other times. And as far as the mother's seclusion, 40 days for a son, 80 days for a daughter, a baby boy's immune system is not adequately developed until about 40 days. A baby girl's takes longer. It is best for the mother to stay at home during those vulnerable times. So, if God had a good medical, scientific reason for giving those rules, maybe he has a good reason for all the other ones that we just haven't discovered yet. Maybe we should just do what he says without questioning his wisdom. God has placed in his word no command which men may obey or disobey at will and not suffer the consequences. If men choose any other path than that of strict obedience, they will find that the end thereof are the ways of death. Proverbs 14:12. Every jot and tittle of the word of God is to be brought into the daily practice. So, whatever God has said, it is by far the best to just do it. Do what he says. Now, I'd like to share something. I've done some work on a project, and it's kind of an ongoing project. I call it the Torah Connection, bringing the Torah to life. And what it is a compilation of all the commandments and statutes and judgments and all of the different laws and commands that God gave in the Torah, as much as what I could find. And like I said, it's an ongoing project, along with other references in the Old Testament and the New Testament that either illustrate it or comment further on it, and then a bunch of quotes from the Spirit of Prophecy that also speak of the subject. They're all kind of brought together in kind of a chronological, orderly way, and I put it together as the Torah Connection, and I have it on our website. Our website is godsfoodforlife.org, and there's the Torah Connection on there. There's also other articles and various Bible studies and things like that. So if you're interested, that is available, and I would encourage you to go there and just have a look at it. It's more of a study tool than it is a definition or a conclusion on anything. It's meant to be just a reference to look into some of those things and study further on them. And so I would just encourage you to check it out. God's Food for Life, and look into the Torah Connection.